Section 13 of Astounding Stories 16, April 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Fournier, Centerville, Virginia, USA. Astounding Stories 16, April 1931, by Various. 4 Miles Within. Chapter 2, The Manhunt. When Phil Holmes started off to the waterhole, his head was full of the earth borer and the imminent descent. Now that the long-awaited time had come, he was at a fever pitch to be off, and it did not take him long to cover the mile of sandy waste. His thoughts were far inside the earth as he dipped the jug into the clear, cool water and sloshed it full. So the rope that snaked softly through the air and dropped in a loop over his shoulders came as a stark surprise. Before he knew what was happening, it had slithered down his arms and drawn taut just above the elbows, and he was yanked powerfully backward and almost fell. But he managed to keep his feet as he staggered backward, and turning his head, he saw the dark figure of his aggressor some 15 feet away, keeping tight the slack. Phil's surprise turned to sudden fury, and he completely lost his head. What he did was rash, mad, and yet, as it turned out, it was the only thing that could have saved him. Instinctively, without hesitating 1 second, and absolutely ignoring an excited command to stand still, he squirmed face on to his aggressor, lowered his head, and charged. The distance was short. Halfway across it, a gun barked, and he heard the bullet crack into the water jug, which he was still holding in front of himself. And even before the splintered fragments reached the ground, he had crashed into the firer. He hit him with all the force of a tackling lineman, and they both went down. The man grunted as the wind was jarred out of him, but he wriggled like an eel, and managed to worm aside and bring up his gun. Then there was a desperate flurry of bodies in the coarse sand. Holmes dived frantically for the gun hand and caught it. But, handicapped as he was by the rope, he could not hold it. Slowly, its muzzle bent upward to firing position. Desperately, he wrenched the arm upwards, in the direction it had been straining to go, and the sudden, unexpected jerk doubled the man's arm and brought the weapon across his chest. For a moment, there was a test of strength, as Phil lay chest to chest over his opponent, the gun blocked between. Then the other grunted, squirmed violently, and there was a muffled explosion. A cry of pain cut the midnight air, and with insane strength Holmes's ambusher fought free from his grip, staggered to his feet, and went reeling away. Phil tore loose from the rope and bounded after him, never feeling, at the moment, his powder-burned chest. And then he halted in his tracks. A great roar came thundering over the desert. At once he knew that it came from the earth borer's disintegrators. The sphere had started down without him. He stood stock still, petrified with surprise, facing the sound, while his attacker melted farther and farther into the night. And then, suddenly, Phil Holmes was sprinting desperately back towards the Guinness camp. He ran until he was exhausted, walked for a little while his legs gathered more strength and his laboring lungs more air, and then ran again. As the minutes passed, the thunder lessened rapidly into a muffled drone, and by the time Phil had panted up to the brink of the hole that gaped where but a little time before the sphere was standing, it had become but a distant purr. He leaned far over and peered into the hot blackness below, but could see nothing. Phil knelt there silently for some minutes, shocked by his strange attack, bewildered by the unexpected descent of the borer. For a time his mind would not work. He had no idea what to do. But gradually his thoughts came to order and made certain things clear. He had been deliberately ambushed. Only by luck had he escaped, he told himself. If it hadn't been for the water jug, he'd now be out of the picture. And on the heels of the ambush had come the surprising descent of the earth borer. The two incidents coincided too well. The same mind had planned them. And 2 men, at least, were in on the plot. It suddenly became very clear to him that the answer to the puzzle lay with the man who had ambushed him. He would have to get that man, track him down. Phil acted with decision. He got to his feet and strode rapidly to the deserted Guinness shack, horribly quiet and lonely now in the bright moonlight. In a minute he emerged with a flashlight at his belt and a rifle across his arm. Once again he went over to the new black hole in the desert and looked down. From far below still came the purr, now fainter than ever. His friend, the girl he loved, were down there, he reflected bitterly, and he was helpless to reach them. Well, there was one thing he could do: go man-hunting. Turning, he started off at a long lope for the waterhole. 10 minutes later he was there, and off to the side he found the marks of their scuffle, and small, black blotches that could be nothing but blood. The other was wounded, could probably not get far. But he might still have his gun, so Phil kept his rifle handy and tempered his impatience with caution as he set out on the trail of the widely spaced footprints. They led off towards the nearby hills, and in the bright moonlight Phil did not use his flashlight at all, except to investigate other round black blotches that made a line parallel to the prints. As he went on, he found his quarry's steps coming more closely together, becoming erratic. Soon they showed as painful drags in the sand, a laborious hauling of one foot after the other. Phil put away his light and advanced very cautiously. He wondered, as he went, who in the devil was behind it all. The radium-finding project had been kept strictly secret. Not another soul was supposed to know about the Earth borer and its daring mission into the heart of the Earth. Yet, obviously, someone had found out, and whoever it was had laid at least part of his scheme cunningly. An old man and a girl cannot offer much resistance. He, Phil, would have been well taken care of had it not been for the water jug. So far, there were at least two in the plot: the man who had ambushed him, and the unknown who had evidently kidnapped both Professor and Sue Guinness. But there might be still more. There might be friends nearby of the man he was tracking. The fellow might have reached them, and warned them that the scheme hadn't gone through, that Phil was loose. They could very easily conceal themselves alongside their partner's tracks and train their rifles on the tracker. The trail was leading up into one of the canyons in the cluster of hills to the west. For some distance he followed it up through a slash of black below the steep moonlit heights of the hills to each side, and then, suddenly, he vaguely made out the forms of two huts just ahead. Immediately he stooped low and went skirting widely off up one side. He proceeded slowly, with great caution, his rifle at the ready. At any moment, he knew, the hush might be split by the cracks of waylaying guns. Warily he advanced along the narrow canyon wall above the huts. No lights were lit, and the place seemed unoccupied. He was debating what to do next, when his attention was attracted to a large, dark object lying in the canyon trail, some 20 yards from the nearest hut. Straining his eyes in the inadequate moonlight, he saw that it was the outstretched figure of a man. His quarry. His ambusher. Phil dropped flat, fearful of being seen. Keeping as best he could in the shadows, fearing every moment to hear the sharp bark of a gun, he crawled forward. It took him a long time to approach the sprawled figure, but he wasn't taking chances. When within 20 feet, he rose suddenly and darted forward to the man's side. His rapid glance showed him that the fellow was completely out, and another quick look around failed to show that anyone else was watching, so he returned to his examination of the man. It was the ambusher, all right, a Mexican. He was still breathing, though his face was drawn and white from the loss of blood from a wound under the blood-soaked clothing near his upper right arm. A hasty search showed that he no longer had his gun, so Phil, satisfied that he was powerless for some time to come, cautiously wormed his way towards the two shacks. There was something sinister in the strange silence that hung over them. One was of queer construction, a windowless, square, high box of galvanized iron. The other was obviously a dwelling place. Carefully, Phil sneaked up to the ladder. Then, rifle ready, he pushed its door open and sent a beam of light stabbing through the darkness of the interior. There was no one there. Only 2 bunks, a table, chair, a pail of water, and some cooking utensils met his view. He crept out toward the other building. Come close, Phil found that a dun-colored canvas had been thrown over the top of it, making an adequate camouflage in daytime. The place was about 20 feet high. He prowled around the metal walls and discovered a rickety door. Again, gun ready, he flung it open. The beam from his flash speared a path through the darkness, and he gasped at sight of what stood revealed. There, inside, was a long, bullet-like tube of metal, the pointed end uppermost and the bottom, which was flat, toward the ground. It was held in a wooden cradle and was slanted at the floor. In the bottom were holes of 2 shapes, rocket tubes and disintegrating projectors. It was another earth borer. Phil stood frozen with surprise before this totally unlooked-for machine. He could easily have been overcome had the owner been in the building, for he had forgotten everything but what his eyes were staring at. He started slowly around the borer, found a long, narrow door slightly ajar, and stepped inside. This borer, like Guinness's, had a double shell, and much the same instruments, though the whole job was simpler and cruder. A small instrument board contained inclination, temperature, depth and air purity indicators, and narrow tubes led to the air rectifiers. But what kept Holmes's attention were the wires running from the magneto to the mixing chambers of the disintegrating tubes. "The fools!" he exclaimed. "They didn't know how to wire the thing. Or else," he added after a moment, "didn't get around to doing it." He noticed that the projectile's interior contained no gyroscope, though he thought none would be needed, for the machine, being long and narrow, could not change keel while in the ground. Here he was reminded of something. Stepping outside, he estimated the angle the borer made with the dirt floor. 20 degrees. And pointed southwest, he exclaimed aloud. This borer would come close to meeting the professor's, 4 miles under our camp. At once he knew what he would do. First, he went back to the other shack and got the pail of water he had noticed, and took this out where the Mexican lay outstretched. He bathed the man's face and the still slightly bleeding bullet wound in his shoulder. Presently the wounded man came to. His eyes opened, and he stared up into a steel mask of a face, in which 2 level black eyes bored into his. He remembered that face, remembered it all too well. He trembled, cowered away. "No!" he gasped, as if he had seen a ghost. "No! No!" "Yes, I'm the man," Holmes told him firmly, menacingly. "The same one you tried to ambush." He paused a moment, then said, "Do you want to live?" It was a simple question, frightening in its simplicity. "Because if you don't answer my questions, I'm going to let you lie here," Phil went on coldly, "and that would probably mean your death. If you do answer, I'll fix you up so you can have a chance." The Mexican nodded eagerly. "I talk," he said. "Good," said Phil. "Then tell me who built that machine." "Señor Quaid. Señor James Quaid." Quaid. Phil had heard the name before. "Of course," he said. "Guinness's old partner." "I not know," the Mexican answered. "He hired me with much money. He buy this machine inside, and we put him together. But he could no make him work. It take too long. We watch. Here old man go down tonight, and—" The greaser stopped. "And so he sent you to get me, while he kidnapped the old man and his daughter and forced them under the ground in their own borer," Holmes supplied, and the other nodded. "But I only mean to tie you," he blurted, gesturing weakly. "I no mean shoot. No, no." "All right, forget it," Phil interrupted. "And now tell me what Quade expects to do down there." "I not know, señor," came the hesitant reply. "But what?" The young man jerked. Reluctantly, the wounded Mexican continued. "Señor Quade, I think he don't like this old man. I think he leave him and the girl down below. Then he come up and say they killed going down." Phil nodded grimly. "I see," he said, voicing his thoughts. "Then he would say that he and Professor Guinness are still partners, and the radium ore will belong to him. Very nice. Very nice." He snapped back to action, and without another word hoisted the Mexican onto his back and carried him into the shack. There he cleansed the wound, rigged up a tight bandage for it, and tied the man to one of the cots. He tied him in such a fashion that he could reach some food and water he put by the cot. "You leave me like this?" the Mexican asked. "Yes," Phil said, and started for the door. "But what are you going to do?" Phil smiled grimly as he flung an answer back over his shoulder. "Me? I'm going to fix the wiring on those disintegrators in your friend Quade's borer. Then I'm starting down after him." He stopped and turned before he closed the door. "And if I don't get back, well, it's just too bad for you." And so, a little later, once more the hushed desert night was cleft by a furious bellow of sound. It came, this time, from a narrow canyon. The steep sides threw the roar back and back again, and the echoes swelled to an earth-shaking blast of sound. The oblong hut from which it came rocked and almost fell. Then, as the noise began to lessen, teetered on its foundations and half slipped into the ragged hole that had been bored inside. The descent was a nightmare that Holmes would never forget. Quade's machine was much cruder and less efficient than the sphere David Guinness had designed. Its protecting insulation proved quite inadequate, and the heat rapidly grew terrific as the borer dug down. Phil became faint, stifled, and his body oozed streams of sweat. And the descent was also bumpy and uneven. Often he was forced to leave the controls and work on the mechanisms of the disintegrators when they faltered and threatened to stop. But in spite of everything, the needle on the depth gauge gradually swung over to 3,000, and 4, and 5. After the first mile, Holmes improvised a way to change the air more rapidly, and it grew a little cooler. He watched the story the depth gauge told with narrowed eyes, and as it reached 3 miles, inspected his rifle. At 3½ miles, he stopped the borer, thinking to try to hear the noise made by the other, but so paralyzed were his eardrums from the terrific thunder beneath, it seemed hardly any quieter when it ceased. His plans were vague. They would have to be made according to the conditions he found. There was a coil of rope in the tube-like interior of the borer, and he hoped to find a cavern or cleft in the earth for lateral exploring. He would stop at a depth of 4 miles, where he should be very near the path of the professor's sphere. But Phil never saw the needle on the gauge rise to 4 miles. At 3¾ came sudden catastrophe. He knew only that there was an awful moment of utter helplessness, when the borer swooped wildly downwards, and the floor was snatched sickeningly from under him. He was thrown violently against the instrument panel, then up toward the pointed top, and at the same instant came a rending crash that drove his senses from him. End of chapter 2.